Hello and welcome to Who Needs Western Civ, a podcast about liberal arts and classical education. I'm your host, Clay Green, a postdoctoral associate here at the Hamilton Center for Classical and Civic Education at the University of Florida. Today I'm going to be talking with Professor Greg McBrayer. Greg is the director of the core curriculum and assistant professor of political science at Ashland University. He's the editor of Xenophon, the Shorter Writings, and co-author of Plato's Euthydemus. He is the co-host of the delightful political philosophy podcast, The New Thinkery. Warning, it's not always safe for work. I think that's a fair description.
You have your headphones in, it's safe.
Because of which I happen to know he is past due on his translation of Xenophon's Hellenica.
That's also true, yeah. Probably because I've generously agreed to be on people's podcasts, which is a big mistake that I've made, you know. It's my generosity. That's my major. It's a character flaw.
Yes. Your largeness of spirit, your magnanimity.
Mm-hmm. You got it. Yeah.
Well, thank you for being on this, Greg. I'm really, really grateful for the chance to talk to you.
Thanks for the invitation, Clay.
So maybe we could start by just telling a little bit about your educational background. How did you become interested in political philosophy? And your appointment is actually in political science.
Yeah, that's right.
Is that right? Okay. So how did you become interested in that? And what kind of education in Western Civ did you have? And what kind of role does that play in what you're interested in today and what you teach?
Yeah, so it's an interesting question. It's always fun to sort of think back and how did I get into this? And, going back in my head to high school and before, mostly I was interested in, as a young man, I was interested in math and science, actually. And I had read a lot as a kid, but high school kind of beat it out of me. I don't know if it was just the mode of the way that it was taught so much as it was probably that even more than the text. Because, they put good stuff in front of you in high school, Shakespeare and Homer and stuff like this. But I don't know, it was too young. It didn't speak to me. Maybe we were just getting selections and not reading whole texts. But like I said, I was just more interested in math and science. Kind of thought I'd go to an engineering school. My dad really wanted me to go to an engineering school. But then I decided I didn't know what I wanted to do in college. So I chose a liberal arts college. And truth be told, the first few years of college were I kind of scuttled about. I had a couple of good teachers. Actually, the best teacher I had was, again, a math teacher. He was a calculus teacher. I had math in high school, calculus my senior year. And like I said, math was always my best subject. I did great in math. And then my senior year of high school, the teacher, she was like, all right, look, you kids are going to pass the AP exam. And so she just sort of became single-mindedly focused on that. And I lost all interest. First day of college calculus, the professor walks in, draws us a curve on the board and says, what's the slope of the angle at this point? And I was like, what? And he's like, yeah, you could figure that out. I'm like, no, I can't. So this professor who put a challenge to me and even just visually seeing what I was trying to do in calculus, it clicked and I became more interested. Most of my classes in so math, I would say, is actually, I'd say that's part of the Western civilization. That's part of a liberal arts education. Mm-hmm. But I think that when most folks are speaking about liberal arts these days, and most of your listeners, we're really talking about what's come to be called the humanities, the classics, that kind of stuff. So English, history, literature, religion. And I'll be frank, most of my education in those disciplines was pretty barren. There was sort of we were never making any progress. We were learning more about books than learning from the books themselves. It was sort of a train of trotting folks out who were all wrong about things. And I thought, why am I wasting my time reading these folks if they're all just wrong? And that all changed my junior year in college. I've told this story 100 times, but I took a class. I thought I was being clever. It would satisfy a general ed requirement and also a major requirement. I was a political science major, not really for any good reason. And I took this class called Classical Political Thought. It was with Bob Bartlett, with whom I've become friends. And we just started reading Plato's Protagoras. And at one point I said, I was sort of a punk kid. And I said, well, I don't think that's right at all, what Socrates says here, And Bob, Professor Bartlett, of course, at the time says, well, why don't you, maybe you're right. Why don't you take him to task? I'll expect your account next week. And if you're right, then we'll go get a cup of coffee and you'll pay. And if you're not, then I'll pay. Then if you're wrong, then you'll pay. And I thought, well, this is the first time in college where somebody had taught me that, like, I could argue with these great books, and that Socrates and Plato and all of these great authors were folks whom you should wrestle with. And so it was really only my junior year of college where I began to see, I'd studied the Bible a little bit as a young man, for example, but I only in my junior year going into my senior year of college that I began to see, there's some books out there and works of art and music that if I'm going to try to understand the world around me, I've got to come to terms with some of them. And that meant for me, first and foremost, Socrates. So, yeah.
Yeah.
Did you know? I mean, I just had no clue. It was just chance. Like I just happened in this class and all of a sudden I'm like, wow, there's all these things that I need to learn. But
nobody's ever turned the tables on me. So I'm not entirely prepared for it.
You can talk to your editor and cut it out if you don't like it, but
let's see. The editor gets paid really, really well. So
good.
Do it. I wanted to study medieval literature because I liked Tolkien. And I took a medieval lit class and I found it really boring.
Yeah.
And then I took a Shakespeare class and a Milton class, and those two just absolutely hooked me.
Knocked your socks off.
Yeah, absolutely.
What Shakespeare did you read? Do you remember?
Of course, Henry V. So it was the history place. Yeah,
the St. Crispin's Day speech.
Exactly.
Is that what?
Yeah. Well, it was in the opening. Oh, for a muse of fire that would ascend the brightest heaven of invention. It was just so cool.
It is cool.
I didn't realize that Shakespeare could be exciting and kind of about the sort of things I liked.
Yeah. I remember when I was a young, again, my high school experience, I think one of the problems is, I don't know what your audience is interested in these kind of things, but I think that for a lot of young boys, 14, 15, 16-year-old boys, Romeo and Juliet's not cutting it.
Right.
It's just not, it just wasn't speaking to my soul at that point in life. And if they had put Henry V in front of me, maybe it would have. So,
I think there's a good chance of that. I mean, I didn't radically change my interests when I became interested in, better literature. I still enjoy many of the same sorts of things that I've always enjoyed, more as well, I hope. But yeah. So I want to press you on Socrates. Sure. Socrates has come up a couple times on this podcast. Assessing the importance of a figure like that is daunting, but maybe just for yourself, like what was it about Socrates that held a particular pull?
Oh man. It's been a 3-decade-long battle at this point. And so it's changed. It's taken some interesting turns, but I think if I had to boil it down to one sort of point, it would be that he seemed to cut through just about everything I'd been taught. And with just a couple of questions, shook the core of so many different opinions that I held dearly, in a way that I'd never encountered. This was the first time I'd ever encountered. I was like, this book's 2,500 years old. How could it possibly change my opinions? And it did, about moral responsibility, about justice, about God, about so many things. And it's increasingly, I've come to see that the questions I've become most interested in are epistemological. And I'm in political science, as you mentioned, in political philosophy. And one of the curiosities, so I was a young person, I was interested in math and science, as I mentioned, but what I was finding increasingly was that they weren't answering questions I was interested in. And they couldn't answer questions of ultimate importance. And I came to realize that Socrates, millennia before I did, had this same experience where he had studied natural science, but realized that he sort of came up to limitations studying them. And so he turned to an investigation of moral and political matters to try and, this is a weird sort of idea here, but he's studying moral and political phenomena to try and get a better grasp of the world. And it's a weird route, and we could talk more about that if you like, but I've come to see that there might actually be great progress to be made this way. So, but I mean, gosh, I don't know. He's impressive. He's interesting. He's funny. He had these impressive students, Plato on the one hand, Xenophon on the other. And then, of course, I encountered the medievals, and I realized that for some of the most important medieval thinkers, Socrates was the guy that you had to wrestle with. And so I think I touched on all the main questions, but morals, philosophy, natural science, metaphysics, God. I don't know. I'm afraid he might be wise. That's the problem.
Do you think he's a great educator?
Yeah, Clay. That's a great question. On the one hand, I'm inclined to say he's probably the best teacher that's ever existed. And the reason I would say that is because what he seems to be able to do is to psychologize in the old-fashioned sense of the word. And so what I mean by that is that he could sort of, talking to a young person, he could sort of figure out what they're really all about. He could figure out what the deepest longings of their souls were. And he could figure out how best to approach young people depending upon what kind of a soul they were. So that's on the one hand. On the other hand, but therefore I think that means that he recognized the great limitations of what's actually possible with people. Some human beings are simply incorrigible. And the comic display of this, I mentioned Plato, of course, but I actually like Xenophon maybe as much, if not better. Xenophon wrote a book called The Symposium, which is about a drinking party. Listeners might be familiar with Plato's Symposium with the same name. And in that book, everyone's having a little festive time, and someone teases Socrates, "Why did you ever get married?" Socrates had this notoriously difficult wife named Xanthippe. And people are sort of heaping scorn upon him. And he says, "Well, I wanted to see if virtue was teachable. And I determined it was not." And so it's a joke, and I don't think it's necessarily as misogynistic as it's meant to be. But I think it's meant to show that he actually is teaching actually possible. I'm not so sure. Maybe it's I'm sure you are, and your listeners are probably more familiar with the allegory of the cave and Plato's Republic, and that real education might be this sort of process of trying to not teach someone, but just get them to turn their head a little bit and look a different direction. So yeah, I think he was a great teacher.
Yeah, that's a great answer, and that makes me want to follow up a little bit about teaching and
Sure, go for it.
Education today. I'm sort of jumping ahead of our schedule a little bit, but it seems appropriate. Do you think that kind of psychologizing, I like the way you described that, psychologizing in the old sense, knowing the soul of someone, do you think that kind of education still happens in the modern university? Is that possible today?
Yes, it is possible. Now, Socrates didn't do this in large lecture halls with 200 students, right? So he did it kind of one-on-one, and we could probably name his students and come up with a list of no more than a couple of dozen.
Yeah.
And so it doesn't seem like it's scalable in the way that modern universities would like for these things to be. But so I teach at a place called the Ashbrook Scholar Program at Ashland University. And one of the reasons I came here is because it seemed like the kind of place where that kind of thing is possible. So it's small. I live a couple hundred yards from campus. We have movie nights, we have reading groups, we go on hikes together. And so you do try to get to know students a little more intimately. I taught prior to coming here at a place called Morehead State University, where a colleague and I, his name is Jonathan Pedluzhny, he and I kind of got involved in teaching in the honors program there. And so we became very intimately involved in the lives of some of the students. I just performed a wedding for two of them, actually. They married one another. And so, but that's probably weird for some people listening. Like, wait a minute, your professor married? Like, well, we came to really love one another, and we became friends, and it became this kind of psychologizing thing.
You always have to say you married. I
helped
two of your students get married.
That's right. I did not
marry two of your students. Yes.
No. I did not marry two of my former students. I performed the wedding ceremony for the two of them. Very good. Yeah.
Much better.
Important clarification. But no, it's possible, but it's not. I mean, it's deeply rewarding to do it well, but one has to have limited expectations. One has to recognize that, in the best case, you're talking about a handful of students a year, and that's really being generous. Yeah.
And what are we turning them to when we're turning them toward the light in the proverbial cave allegory?
Right.
Maybe you could just speak about your own class. What, in your mind, what is it that students are either being awakened to or having their attention turned to in the best case?
Yeah, that's a tough question.
I'm sorry, I'm asking you all the hard questions.
No, it's fine.
Up front.
You should have on a guy named Ben Story. He now works at AEI, I think. Is that right? He was at Furman before.
I don't know.
He and I were at a conference last spring in Houston, and we had a discussion about this, and we were on similar sides of this, although I think I was a little more he was much more measured, and I appreciated his talk much better than my own. But So that's a good. So what are you turning them on to? What are you trying to do? Ben's story was suggesting, and I was suggesting, that most students don't come to college prepared to get a real liberal education anymore. They're just not. Again, this psychologizing. They're not psychologically prepared. By which I mean, so I'll give you the example of I teach in the Ashbrook Center, and we're kind of devoted to the principles of American citizenship. I think grabbing an 18-year-old and trying to get them to become civic-minded and to like their country is difficult. Sure. They're already very, very formed by that point. And some thinkers whom I greatly admire think that a serious moral and political education is a prerequisite for liberal education. And I happen to be sympathetic to that, and I don't know how sophisticated you want to get there, and so what I found is a lot of students are not prepared yet to have the kind of liberating moments that you'd like to have. And so there's a certain amount of providing them with the moral and political education that is salutary. So teaching them good things that are true, and then that are helpful for life. And Ben's story put it really well. He's like, look, we shouldn't be teaching them Rousseau and Nietzsche and be like, these guys have these devastating, last man, and it's all cynical, and teach them all to wear black and stuff like this, and wear black eyelashes and black, all right, we should be providing them with models of lives well lived. And that I agree with to a great deal. So like Ben is, he and his wife, they teach together. I think they do model this well for their students. And to the degree that I live in this small community and the students see that I have friends and that I live a sort of decent life, and that's really important. And that's probably the first thing. But then the second thing, the more important thing, the enlightening bit, you just have to, you have to be careful, and you have to tread lightly, and I don't want to rock their opinions if there's not something decent to put in its place. I think that sometimes professors of liberal education can want to simply be like iconoclasts and destroy people's ideas. And I think that's probably unhealthy and unwise. So yeah. I don't know that, but so I don't know, the first time a student realizes that, oh my God, I never realized that there's a problem with justice. It's the simple thing, right? Like you're reading Plato's Republic for the first time, and they're like, they think they know what justice is. Like, and probably as an 18-year-old kid, you don't. I think I can say that with some confidence.
I certainly didn't. So
yeah, but I thought I did. I don't know about you.
Oh, sure, yeah. Oh, yeah, I knew what justice was. Yeah. Justice was my way.
Exactly. Yeah, you got it. Yeah,
more or less. Yeah. There's a lot that's great in your answer. I really like the idea of modeling for students a life well lived, and I think maybe that could mean a lot of things. One of the things that I try to convey to students is that and I think they believe me because of my enthusiasm in class or whatever it is, that everything is interesting to me. I find everything interesting, right? And that's maybe not quite as important as some of the issues of morality that maybe you're thinking about.
Right.
It is a part of a life well lived, I think, is modeling. Like you can have this incredible richness if you open yourself up.
One of my friends who's also a PhD in political philosophy, he and I were talking just the other night, and he said, it's crazy. So many of our comrades, that may not be the word you use, I can't remember, but so many of us who've done political philosophy and all we study is like human happiness and human flourishing. He's like, they're all miserable.
Yeah, sure.
And I said, yeah, you're right. Like, what have your studies gotten for you?
Right.
I love doing this stuff. I think you're right. The idea of like being excited by books, being excited by ideas, and seeing, and then of course the other stuff, right? Like, taking care of myself, trying to be a good member of the community, this kind of stuff as well. Yeah, definitely. That's right.
When are you going to start doing those things?
Yeah, soon, very soon.
Okay,
very soon.
Good.
It's on my to-do list.
Okay. So I wanted to ask you this hard question, and it's hard because we all think we know what we mean by the term Western civilization until we start using it. So maybe a way of framing it rather than just the definition is there was a semi-famous Guardian article from a few years ago that challenged the existence of something called Western civilization. Said there's no such thing as Western civilization. I'm sure this is something you've heard before. You might also have heard Western civilization called a kind of dog whistle. That's the phrase that it really means something like white supremacy, or it really means some other form of oppression. It's the quiet way of saying this really nasty thing. Now, I assume you don't think that, but do you think that Western civilization?
Thank you for that generous, yeah, very good.
I'm just making a guess. Do you think that Western civilization is a meaningful term? And I think that's different than knowing exactly what it is. And why or why not? Is it a term you would use?
Yeah, it is a term I would use. The first challenge, so there are two challenges as you put them out. One is there even such a thing? And the second is, isn't it really just racist?
Yeah.
The first one seems like a more serious challenge. The second one is a challenge. And I don't know if hopefully your listeners aren't on this god-awful website called X, formerly known as Twitter.
Okay.
But there are misuses of sort of the classics of Western civilization, and that's simply true.
Right.
But there are all kinds of people misusing and abusing all sorts of things, and that doesn't mean people have misused Christianity and abused it. Does that mean that Christianity is those things?
Sure.
I don't think so. So with respect to the racist thing, what I would say is a serious answer to the racist thing is it's weird to me to speak of Western civilization as monolithically white, for example. I mean, it's clearly not.
It's clearly not, right?
And to go back in history and speak to some of these folks and to explain to them that we perceive them to be white would mystify them. They wouldn't understand what that means.
Right.
But sort of the more serious thing is, it's clear to me that the study of non-Western things is also important. Yes. And can greatly complement what you're doing in the study of Western civilization. But at the end of the day, you and I, and probably most people listening, are Westerners.
Right.
Which means that you and I and your audience have all been shaped fundamentally by some of the same ideas, the same fundamental alternatives. And that, for me, that means principally Athens on one hand, and the way of life that sort of suggests the life of science, philosophy, and the way of Jerusalem, which admittedly isn't even out of the West, it's sort of out of the Middle East, but it seems to have infiltrated Western civilization. I mean, it's enormously, right? And then also maybe Rome, of course. I think Remy Brogg would say that Rome has also been a deep influence on the West. And so to understand ourselves, it seems to me, we would do ourselves justice by looking at the greatest thinkers in our own tradition. And that can be done out of a kind of parochialism, but can also be done out of a serious sense to try and understand yourself. Like when I started studying Socrates, it wasn't because I was like, oh, I like this guy and he's like me. It was like, this guy's a jerk and he's wrong. And I wrestled with him in an attempt to prove that he was wrong. So is it racist? That strikes me as wrong. And it includes some folks of various races. It's sad to me that it has been appropriated in this way by some folks. Does it exist? That seems like a more serious question. So again, on the one hand, of course it exists, right? There is this body of things that we've all read. I'm aware, of course, that people saying that it only emerged in like the last 100 years or something like this, and it was a specific academic sort of thing. But speaking generally, of course, something like this exists. Of course, there are major texts that have stood the test of time and that have done so, not because they necessarily provide answers definitively, but because they address questions that are of fundamental human importance that any thinking human being has to address, right? We're all going to die, and therefore we can all learn from the death of Ivan Ilyich. We may not all fall in love, but love will be a consideration for any human being in the West. And they're just the great romantic novels, Plato's Symposium, Christian accounts of love. These are things that one should wrestle with as alternatives. And so while it's difficult to say, yes, clearly there is Western civilization and it is this one thing, it does strike me that there are peaks throughout history in our hemisphere, in the Western hemisphere and in Europe, where, these things are just, this used to be, people didn't argue about this. It's just sort of it made sense. There is this history, there is this tradition. Yeah, I have more to say there, but I don't know. I guess I'd retreat back to what the message I said just a moment ago. If you take education to be the quest for self-knowledge, it seems to me that there are two fundamental ways to do that. One is knowing yourself and therefore knowing the things that influence you, or doing it by looking at some other. So, but that challenge of looking at non-Western things to understand ourselves, while could be extremely fruitful, strikes me as enormously difficult. So I've been reading through the last several years, for example, some of the great texts of the world religions. And it's mind-boggling. It's amazing on the one hand, right? But on the other hand, it's so foreign. And I just feel so ill-equipped to be able to do it justice. I don't even know what translations to use. And I don't even know who to ask what translations to use. I don't know how much hinges on keywords and phrases. My last school I taught in the honors program, as I mentioned, and I was asked to teach a class on the ancient world, and the class syllabus said Greece and Rome. It was like ancient world : Greece and Rome. So one young lady was very upset that I wasn't teaching the classics of China. So I had to have a meeting with her at the request of the director of the honors program. We all sat down, and I said, I need you to understand that I'm teaching Homer in this class. And she said, yeah. I'm a professor of Greek political thought. I have an expertise, such as it is, in Plato and Xenophon and Aristotle. I have been sweating for weeks to prepare to teach Homer for the first time. This is so far outside of my, I don't think you understand how much work is required for me to teach Homer. Throwing in Confucius, which actually I have taught, but only sort of very superficially. I'm just not competent to do it. And we just don't have folks. Maybe it's a little sad, but I just don't think we have folks available to us who can provide us guidance that is desperately needed if we're going to read those texts.
Yeah, I have a similar story. English departments frequently offer world literature class, and that's it's a great pleasure to teach that. It can be quite parochial, teaching only English texts.
Yeah, of course.
But it's one thing to teach Voltaire. It's another thing to teach The Journey to the West, a Chinese classic, one of the Chinese classic novels. And I remember teaching it, and the way that content was conveyed, the types of things that were meaningful were totally foreign to me. And there's this character, I don't know if you know anything about it, but it's about this character, among others, named Monkey, or the Monkey King.
Okay.
Who goes on adventures. I don't want to undersell it at all. It seemed like an incredibly deep text, but foreign to me. And Monkey King had all of these different transformations that he could do, and that there were a certain number of them. I don't remember how many, 1,200 or something like that. 1,200 different things he could transform into. And I was thinking, this is so foreign. And then actually a few weeks ago, I had a moment, I was reading a little bit of Angelo Poliziano, a 15th century Italian writer. And it was it's a poem about Venus who's laying there on her couch, and Cupid, Eros with her, his wings comes out and does. And I was thinking that this would be just as foreign and just as strange. That it really is. It's strange. I mean, I think the first time anybody sees an old European painting and sees Cupidos and Zephyr in the corner blowing, it looks very odd, right? And so I remind myself that estrangement is, it does go away. But this does lead me to a hard question that I've posed before on this podcast, which is you're highlighting the difference between teaching Western civilization or appreciating Western civilization because it is ours, versus because it is good.
Yes,
those are two different things, right?
Sure, they are.
How do you think about that difference, if you do?
Yeah, well, I mean, I've been trying to defend it on the basis of it being ours, but hopefully I wasn't coming across as simply a kind of nativistic defense of it. What I meant was you and I, as Westerners, probably have a lot of opinions about the world that we're unaware of the source of those opinions. And so understanding Western civilization can help us to understand ourselves, and can help us to understand even that some of those things that we think we understand about the world are wrong once we see where they came from or something like that. Now, I would say in the best case, it's the things that are ours that are good, and they're good precisely because they've helped some of us be able to wrangle out of some of these messes. Now, I'll just say as an aside, in graduate school, I became very interested in Islamic political thought. I remain very interested in Islamic political thought. And I think that I'll just be frank. I think that the best medieval commentators on Greek philosophy were Muslim or Arabic. And that's weird. And by the way, for them, Greek philosophy was this weird moment where they discovered something else. And it was like intellectual dynamite. They're like, look, what is, like, they had this book, they had their way, you know, they understand this tells us how the world is, it tells us how to act. And then somebody's like, hey, I found this book by this guy called Aristotle, and it just exploded everything that they thought. And so I think it's entirely possible to have this encounter with the other and to make great progress. Like, I mean, you know, Greek philosophy was foreign to these folks. And Islamic philosophy, as far as it helped me to understand Greek philosophy, was very foreign to me. Now, I happen to have had some good guides in that. My mentor's name is Charles Butterworth. He's an expert in the language. I've taken a handful of semesters of Arabic, not by any stretch enough to understand anything, but at least enough to be able to pick out a word here or there. And then he had a teacher. And so there's some ground that's been paved before me, so I can make some progress there. And by the way, there's a lot of not very good stuff written in the West. And so simply the fact that it comes from our people may not help us. You know, reading Jughead comics may not help me to understand myself. But maybe it will. I don't know. So there's that. I mean, look, I genuinely believe that there probably are, and in addition to the works you just mentioned, there probably are great Japanese works, Chinese works, Indian works. I just don't know how to pick them. It's very, very hard. I mean, I started with, you know, the Bhagavad Gita and the Analects and, you know, the text that everyone knows. But again, like, okay, I mean, how do I, now that I've done what I've done in Greek philosophy and realizing that the best authors are very, very careful in how they write. If I can't trust that a translator is being very careful in transmitting that to me, then I have no idea what's, like, I read Confucius and I sort of, I'll give you an example. When I read Confucius, I see a sort of a defense of convention, a defense of paternal authority. And therefore, I don't see what I would call philosophy. Now, if I knew the language well, is it possible that maybe Confucius is undermining this at various points and actually exploring tensions? I simply don't know. I mean, maybe. But that's when I realized, like, until I can find somebody who can guide me on this, I can't do it.
Yeah, totally. I mean, that's an interesting point, because is Joseph de Maistre a philosopher? Is Robert Filmer a philosopher? Is Thomas Hooker a philosopher? You'll find defenses of convention.
Yeah, of course.
A kind of paternal
right.
authority.
No, that's a good. And of course, there are defenses of paternal authority in the West. Yes, of course.
Yeah. But I take the point that, you know, some of these texts can be unapproachable, and sometimes it feels like the language has been dumbed down, maybe in the translation process. But you know, we just don't know, right? So it's just so hard to speculate.
But as you mentioned, I mean, for me, you know, Greek was foreign to me.
Exactly.
The gods, the pantheon.
Totally.
Yeah, I just like, yeah.
Yeah.
There's just, sadly, we live these finite lives and we just have to choose. I mean, there's no, right? It's completely accidental. I mean, if I'd run into a professor who'd managed to show me the beauty of the inside of a different set of books, maybe that's the direction I would have gone.
Absolutely. I keep that kind of awareness as well. And the finite thing, it reminds me, I was thinking as we were talking about Western civilization, you know, you mentioned the fact that there are a lot of bad books written in the West. And we don't necessarily teach those as part of Western civilization.
Right.
And I think that there is a distinction to be made. I don't know how much either one of us has theorized this, but this is one of the things I want to be thinking about in this podcast, between talking about civilization and talking about something like culture, in the way that it might be used in anthropology, where a cultural anthropologist will be interested in, as it were, everything in a culture. Right. And privileging things would actually kind of distort the field. But the idea of civilization, you know, it's as you know, it's a kind of normative word, a positive word. It is opposed to certain things. That's one of the things people perhaps don't like about it. But there is a sense in which, you know, when you think of Western civilization, you think of, you know, Michelangelo's David, right? but you
Yeah.
don't think of some of the drawings in my desk drawer. But in
Probably not.
some sense, they're both products of that
Yeah.
hurt, by the way.
No, I haven't seen them, so I should reserve judgment,
Well,
I
yeah,
suppose.
but the fact that you made that prejudgment, that accurate
Yeah.
prejudgment, is very good. But we don't think about that. So
Right.
yeah, I mean, do you think that this term civilization, again, I don't know how much
Right.
either of us have theorized this, but does contain a sense that some things should be read rather than other things, or studied rather than other things.
Yeah, I mean that's a great question. I love the way you brought up culture, because I mean you're right. My interest in, like, I'm not interested in all. It's funny, like I studied Greek philosophy, right? And so like my relatives or friends will like get me Greek stuff. Like,
Yeah.
oh, here's this nice plate. That's, I'm like, I don't care about like pots and
I
like
love that.
I mean,
Yeah.
like, because they think, well, you're interested in Greek things. I'm like, well, Socrates just happened to be Greek. I don't
Yeah.
really think it's
Yeah, I'm the
so
same
that-
way. I don't have the endless interest in 1600s England that
right. Oh, and the other fun thing
I'm
is when
very
people are
interested
like, oh,
in, but yeah,
people be like, well, wouldn't you like to live in ancient Greece? I'm like, no, God, no.
it'd
Like,
be a terrible place
I
to
probably
live.
have died of dysentery 5 times over by
It'd
now.
be a
Like,
terrible place to live.
that's awful. Like, I
Yeah.
love air conditioning, and we have books. And by the way, I come from a poor family. I would have never received this great education.
And you get to wear clothes at the gym as well.
I do. Yeah. Well, that's a downside, but we all have their costs, I suppose. But one small point and then a serious point. I'm a fan of the late great Paul Cantor, and he did all these. He's done such great work on Shakespeare. You can find him on YouTube. He's all over the place. He left behind a great legacy. And one of the things that I like to keep in the back of my mind is he sort of wags his finger at all of us faculty members who are like, oh, if it's not old and classic and et cetera, et cetera. He tries to remind us that Shakespeare was pop culture at the time. And it was basically the equivalent of television. Mm-hmm. And so it's weird that for us now we put Shakespeare on this pedestal when at the time the high art people were saying this is garbage. Mm-hmm. And so that does keep me a little bit open to the notion that maybe there is some good stuff in some weird places these days. And he, in fact, actually talked about television being one of those places, which may or may not be the case. And so, yeah, on the one hand, I do think that when we're talking about Western civilization, we're talking about, in my head, we're talking about classics, and classic means both old and best. And so, because we're finite creatures, I find myself increasingly trying to limit how much non-great stuff I read. I still, occasionally you still have, there's room for a nice little spy thriller in there or something like this. But by and large, I try to read the great things. And is it discriminating? Yes, it is. I mean, but we're finite creatures. There's only so much time. And I defer greatly to the judgments of people who came before me. Maybe that's kind of traditional or conservative, but the texts themselves are not traditional or conservative. I mean, if you read Plato's Republic, it's not like, or anything that's on my bookshelf that I love. So, yeah.
That's a great point. Greg can probably see that I have a portrait. It's hard to make out, but I have a portrait of Ralph Waldo Emerson.
Oh, very nice.
Is a personal hero of mine. And yet I sort of acknowledge that there's a contradiction in revering and trying to follow after in the steps of someone whose primary philosophy was about not following anyone. About being a kind of independent thinker.
Right.
And Socrates is a kind of example of that, maybe.
Oh, yeah. I mean, it's one of my good friends here who happens to be a Milton scholar. As I was trying to collaborate with her on some things, and the organization I work for has a reputation for being a little right of center, which is, I guess, fair to say of me as well, a little bit, but not really. But I won her over by saying, look, these are the books I want to teach. Like, I promise you, not one of them has any kind of like Locke, for example. I mean, I realize that there's a kind of traditional, conventional reading of John Locke, but boy, that's not what I see in Locke, and that's not what I see in Hobbes, and it's not what I see in Machiavelli, and it's not what I see in Plato. It's not what I see in Aristotle, despite appearances. It's not what I see in. We teach Marx, we teach Smith, we teach, and so it's weirdly, there's this little paradox, I suppose, because it is kind of traditional insofar as there's something like a canon, or here, but the texts themselves are far from it. So I'm teaching. I was actually in charge of all freshman a colleague and I were somehow put in charge of all first-year seminars here at Ashland University. And we decided to have a common reading, The Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, an American Slave, written by himself, excuse me. And some of my colleagues initially pushed back because they thought, well, this is just rah, 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 pro-American. I'm like, have you read this book?
No, yeah, it's not at all.
It is not what's going on in this book. And so then, much to my pleasure, many of them then read it and thought, oh my God, this really is, it's a beautiful book about the human condition.
Yeah.
And about the horrible injustice of slavery and about the contradictions inherent at the heart of it. And for me, I love I'm opposed to slavery. I think it's bad, but it's not, for me, it's a beautiful book because it's about the human spirit and its resilience. Like that no matter all these impediments, here's this young man who sort of still became, infinitely more impressive than I'll ever become, for example. I don't know. So there's that.
Yeah,
well.
that's a great example. And it was, right, a text like that, and you read it and you see how it was explosive in its day, right?
Oh, yeah.
You can feel that. Yeah, and that's so often the case with classics. You mentioned Confucius earlier, and Chinese society, as I understand, or Chinese culture traditionally has a kind of classicism, right, where they're reading old classic texts and things like this, and even testing on them, right, as part of the civil service exam. And
Right.
Western European countries had that as well. England had that for to serve in the empire.
Right.
You were taking tests on what? On your ability to read Greek and Latin authors.
Yeah, of course, naturally.
And so there's a strange there is a bit of a contradiction. I don't think it goes all the way to being a problem, but there's a bit of a contradiction in kind of slavishly studying or imitating.
Yeah, right. No, of course there is. Yeah.
Texts like this. Once again, Emerson said, Shakespeare will not be made by the study of Shakespeare.
Right.
Chastening to all English professors.
I have so many colleagues that, I mean, they're like, you can't read these books and you can't understand this book unless you understand the secondary literature. I'm like, look, Shakespeare wasn't writing for scholars.
Totally.
He wasn't writing for people to put footnotes.
Right.
Shakespeare was talking directly to people and trying to educate them about the human condition. And that's,
he wasn't even writing to be read, right?
Yeah, right.
He was writing for like your point about Paul Cantor, that he was writing to entertain in a deep sense, right? To show people a meaningful
I do wonder in Shakespeare's case if he wasn't. I wonder. I honestly don't know if he wasn't also intentionally writing. That some things were for a crowd who would be watching, and that others would have, that people would benefit from rereading this thing.
Yes. Well, I'm having my colleague Jill Ingram on in a couple of weeks, and she's a Shakespearean, so I'm going to make sure not to say anything that I could get.
Write that question down. For
I will certainly write it down. Yeah, absolutely. Well, this has been great so far, Greg.
Thanks, Clay.
I have just a few more questions here, and maybe we can begin winding things down. We've had a great conversation about the kind of joys and positive side of Western Civ, and it's one of the things I like about you on the New Thinkery podcast is that you're a positive person.
Thank you.
At least you come off.
However,
right.
Yeah.
If everyone thought that it was a good idea to teach Western Civ, or people didn't take the challenges really seriously, I probably wouldn't have this podcast. So why is it that you think people challenge Western Civ? I mentioned, a couple arguments. Maybe it doesn't exist. Maybe it's simply racist. But I don't know about you, but I know a lot of very smart and very educated people, even people who are interested in some of the texts I'm interested in, who think that the term is not that the term is dangerous or pernicious in some way. Why do you think that is?
Well, I think there's, as I tried to allude to earlier, I do think that sometimes there is something to these criticisms, right? I mean, some of the friends of Western Civ, they don't do us a lot of favors. I mean, if they're pushing it for traditional reasons, if they're pushing it for reasons that can be associated with some of the things you're talking about, that's kind of bad. Does this mean that non-Western things get excluded? These are problems. But the biggest reason for me why I think that folks fail to appreciate it, and I know that, I mean, is because they haven't done it.
Sure.
They haven't had that encounter with these books that I've had. For me, it's just putting people next to these things and showing them that it's not. And if the phrase Western civilization, I mean, at the end of the day, I share your interest in Western Civ. I think it's deeply important. But if you want to call it something else, call it something else. I don't care. Like, let's read the great books, or don't you like that also? Okay, also the great books is problematic. Okay, fine. What do you want to call it? I mean, can we read Shakespeare? Can we agree that Shakespeare's worth reading? Shakespeare's racist. Okay, let's read Othello and see if we think that that's true. Or if Shakespeare's exposing the racism of others, maybe in The Merchant of Venice he's doing that as well. Maybe Shakespeare is not as convinced as we are of the possibility of a multicultural regime. Maybe he can. Let's show him why is he wrong. Let's figure that out. I do think that a lot of his ignorance. I think that a lot of folks just haven't had the experience, the joy, like you and I have had, of having some of our opinions exploded. And I think that's another thing. If they saw. I mean, look, the study of Western civilization has greatly moderated me, and I've seen it have a moderating effect on a lot of other people. And so I think that they're mistaken if they think that it's associated with some of these nastier things, essentially, that's what it's for. So I don't know. Maybe that's not entirely satisfactory, but.
No, I think that's a great answer. I mean, I think it's worth always thinking about challenges seriously, right?
Right.
And I appreciate your considering the possibility of giving ground on even the name. I'd have to rename the podcast.
Yeah, don't do that. Don't do that. The coffee mugs are already been made, so
exactly. They're flying off the shelves.
Yeah.
That I think that's worth taking seriously. And and the question of whether something like this exists is a useful question, because it prompts you to think about, well, in what sense does it exist? You mentioned your interest these days in epistemology, and if you start thinking about that question deeply, you realize how complicated it would be to say that something like that exists.
Right.
So I really appreciate your answer, and I appreciate the genuinely ironic attitude. I think it's better than
I can go. Yeah, I will say, just for what it's worth. I mean, having been. I have a couple of things to say. First is practical, and the second one's a little more theoretical. But so I'm faculty senate president at the school I'm at now. I'd been elected president.
I'm sorry for your loss.
Yeah, me too. It's been a huge loss of time, and I'd been elected that at my last job too. And how do we do these things? I think that a lot of people can be won over with optimism and just meeting you and realizing, like, you're not a terrible human being. This goes back to the modeling thing for students as well. You model your things for your peers. I mean, some of my biggest fans on campus are folks with whom I think I agree the least, on politics and matters of partisan things, because they just see that, like, oh, he is serious, and like, he really doesn't care about, and I don't care about the partisan leanings of my students one way or the other. And I've tried it everywhere I've taught. It's harder now that I'm affiliated with a center, but most places I've taught, I've tried to leave that out of the classroom and let students not even know, because it doesn't matter. But you can. It depends on, Clay, are we talking about how do we win people over in a small scale or a big scale? Like, at a small place, at a small college, I think you can win a lot of friends by being friendly, and recognizing when your opponents are right, and when you're disagreeing politely, and hey, let's you think this book's great? Let's get together and read it, and you can show me how, show me why. Giving and taking. I mean, there's a lot of pragmatism that can go into being successful on a college campus. Now, the wider community doing something else, I don't know. This podcast can go a long way in winning over critics, I think. But the more serious points, secondly, one thing you can do with folks, depending on, again, one-on-one or how serious, I've been going back to this idea of showing them that the texts themselves aren't what they think they are, that the texts aren't as biased or pro-white or pro-male or et cetera, et cetera. My guy Socrates, I'll return to him. Epistemology, right? Socrates claims he doesn't know anything repeatedly in almost all the dialogues, right? There are two notable exceptions. There are two things that Socrates claims that he knows with epistemic certainty. One of them is love, and he claims that he learned that from a woman. And the other, weirdly enough, is how to give funeral speeches. And he claims, again, weirdly enough, that he learned that from a woman. At the end of the apology, when Socrates has been sentenced to die, he says, well, I hope when I die, I get to go talk to the interesting men and women in Hades. So he includes women. And I think, I don't want to do too many steps here, but it seems clear to me that, and he only ever spoke to young men in Athens. And I think that he's showing you the reason why. It's not that I, Socrates, am sexist. It's that this regime has so denatured women and subjugated them that they're not interesting people to talk to. You've married them off at 12 and 13 and you keep them indoors. The regime treats women unjustly. And also in the case of the Meno, right? I mean, he shows those present that this human being whom they all think is a slave is capable of doing geometry. So these greatest thinkers, I think if you show people that, look, these greatest thinkers are not nearly as sexist, racist, homophobic, whatever you want to go, as you probably think they are if you read them carefully. That's a huge part of it too, I would say. And that's not just Socrates. You can go up and down the list, right? So
yeah, I've been asked casually by colleagues, different people, what do you teach in the Hamilton Center? What are you putting into what are you putting into them? And usually
you guys just put the musical on all the time, I assume.
Exactly. Yeah.
Right. Okay. Good.
Yeah. I usually do the rapping, of course.
Yeah. Obviously.
But I usually say, and I'm not trying to be smug, I say, well, personally, I hope students realize that all men and women are created free and equal, and that they're endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights.
That sounds familiar.
Yeah. And the truth is that I think you're hard pressed actually to find too many people in our regime who would disagree with a statement like that.
Yeah. Right.
Maybe for better or worse reasons, but it's remarkably good for building bridges, because the truth is that left or right, I mean, most people's values in our society are about recognizing and respecting the freedom and equality of each person.
Right.
And many of these texts help us get there.
I agree.
Yeah. So thank you for your responses.
Answer.
Those were really, really helpful. And listening to you reminded me a little bit of your podcast, especially when you were going into the Socrates stories, which I've very much enjoyed. You taking us through some of those dialogues and other texts on that podcast. So the podcast is called The New Thinkery.
Yeah, that's right.
Could you just say a little bit about why you started it?
Oh, sure.
What it's for, who the
audience is.
well,
the co-host.
I think I'm the audience. I think
Clay. Yeah, very good.
It's just me. So just say a little bit about that and what the experience.
Of course. Is. So it's called The New Thinkery, as you mentioned, which I'm sure a lot of your audience will know because they're well educated and sophisticated and handsome. That's a reference to Aristophanes' play The Clouds. In that play, Socrates practices his philosophizing at a place called the Thinkery or the Thinkatorium or the something like that. It's some weird Greek word. And so when we were trying to come up with a name for our podcast, I guess I should back up a little bit. When we were starting our podcast, David Barr and Alex Prio are my co-hosts. David Barr and I met we met years ago. Sorry. We met one time in 2015 in DC. I had the idea. I was moving here to Ashland and I was like, I kind of want to get a podcast started. And we met with actually Bill Crystal of the Weekly Standard. And we had an hour-long conversation with him about his very successful podcast called Conversations with Bill Crystal.
I love that podcast.
It's a great podcast. He has great guests. And I sort of said, well, look, here's what I want to do. And it was very serious. But we kind of want to do philosophy. And he said eventually, look, you guys should, this doesn't sound like what you really want to do. You should do what you want to do. And so that stuck in the back of my head. Secondarily, Alex Prio and I would go to conferences, and we noticed that we're sort of middle-aged scholars. He would be mad if I said that, but what I mean is we're not fresh out of grad school, and we're not very well established. And so what we noticed is Alex and I have become sort of very friendly with a bunch of senior scholars on one hand, and a bunch of grad student aged kids like hanging out with us because we have potty mouths and we joke around. And so what we noticed is that people would love hanging out at the bars of the hotels with us at these conferences, listening to Alex and me bridge the gap between the older generation and them, and talking, alternatingly about Plato, epistemology, ontology, Kant, Nietzsche, Rousseau, and then fart jokes, and then drinking too much. And so you put those two conversations together, me, David, Bill Crystal on one hand, and then me, Alex on the other, and the three of us got together and we started texting each other, and we're like, I think people would listen to this. This combination, and your listeners should be advised, like, we do get a little blue, we do get a little low brow. I don't, but my friends do. I'm actually on the up and up.
Listener, be advised.
Be advised.
Greg is underselling how blue they get, but also how entertaining it is.
It's very blue.
Yes.
It's very, very blue. And I sometimes have to chastise them for getting a little too blue.
Yeah, it's mostly Alex, it seems.
It's Alex. It's definitely Alex.
Yeah.
So, and turns out we were right. I mean, the podcast does very well. I hope yours similarly does well, but finding an audience is kind of key. We just thought, this goes back to something you and I were talking about 15, 20 minutes ago. So many academics think that what this is about is sort of minutia and details and footnotes and arguing. And we're just sort of like, look, we're very serious, Alex and I and David. We think these books are deeply serious, and they've changed my life in fundamental ways and changed my opinions about things seriously. But that doesn't mean it can't be fun. And so we try to have a great deal of fun, and we try to model that life for people too. Like, here's three friends descending the lowest of lows and ascending to the highest of highs together, right? And that's what it's about. Yeah, it's a lot of fun. Thanks for listening.
I would highly recommend the New Think Read to anybody who enjoys this conversation and would like to hear more from Greg. I think it's a really great podcast.
Thanks, Clay.
So I just have one more question for you. You've been very, very generous with your time as being president of Faculty
I bill by the
Senate.
minute.
Yeah. Well, okay. Well, I'll send it to the accounting department.
Good.
If you could take any thinker from the past and warp him up to the present and get him up to speed and have a conversation, get his or her perspective, who would it be?
Well, I know you expect me to say Socrates or Plato or Xenophon. They're in my wheelhouse. And if I could summon Aristotle so I could finally understand something about being, that would be up there. But for contemporary times, I'm going to choose Aristophanes because I think that there are a lot of similarities between. I hate drawing these rough parallels. I mean, clearly there's a lot of very, very important differences. But I think that our time begs for someone who could satirize us properly.
Yeah.
And I feel like Aristophanes could do that. Maybe a Jonathan Swift type, right? Like, we need to be ridiculed, and we have such terrible ridiculers, sort of mediocre.
We do. Yeah.
We need someone to make us laugh and to point out our serious hypocrisies and flaws. I think my answer would be Aristophanes.
I think that's a fantastic answer. So hopefully
Thanks.
They're working on that time travel technology
Right.
in the wonderful science departments at Ashland University.
Of course.
Well, thank you so much, Greg, and
Thanks, Clay.
really appreciate you helping out and helping out a novice podcaster like myself. And
You did great.
all right, thanks, Greg.
Thanks, Clay.